Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with my Bretonia unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And this is a complete joke of a tier list as far as I see it, but people did ask me to do it. I'm not quite sure why. Like, it's very clear what's worth it and what isn't worth it with Bretonia from my perspective. Basically, with the exception of a handful of specialist units or a handful of units, most of the Bretonnian roster is not worth bothering with. The infantry roster, the range roster, different discussion with artillery to be sure, but even some portion of the cavalry roster may not necessarily be worth recruiting. And let's actually start with cavalry because that is the focus of Bretonia in a campaign. So we start with mounted yeomans. Yeah, both of them are F tier units. Like the light cav unit is like Kislev dervishes. Actually, Kislev dervishes might genuinely be a better unit. Okay, but what about the mounted archers? Well, first off, they are the worst mounted archer unit, mounted skirmisher unit in the entire game. Like every other unit is better. From a range perspective, from a melee perspective, from a morale perspective, from a durability perspective, almost every other unit outclasses these guys by quite a bit. But on top of that, Bretonia doesn't necessarily care as much about skirmishing capability as some other factions. I mean, I guess one could be useful in some very, very limited situations, and you will get the building from these to get these guys. But I would dare say that there's absolutely no point in recruiting them. Then we have Knights Errant. I would go ahead and say that Knights Errant are a D tier unit. The only reason you recruit Knights Errant is because you have no other alternative. They're trying to be Empire Knights. They are at the same tier at Empire Knights, but Empire Knights are more akin to Knights of the Realm. They have pros and cons compared to Knights of the Realm. More durability, less damage. Knights Errant, I'm not sure exactly what to compare them to, really, as far as cav units go. They can cost quite a bit to recruit, especially when you're considering the VOW situation in Bretonia. Or rather, they cost quite a bit to maintain. And the sole reason you recruit these guys is because you haven't gotten to tier 3 to actually get your proper cavalry options. So with that, so you're looking at a unit that's only used as a filler unit, if even that, then you only bother with very early on in your campaign, and after that you move on to better stuff. It is better in a Bretonnian campaign to recruit proper knights from a province far away than actually recruit these guys on the field, from my point of view. Like, unless you desperately need to recruit a unit, and even then you might actually have better options. Like, if you're looking at recruiting something to fill up your army, you might have better options. Like, let's assume you have an entire proper army of Bretonia, multiple armies, you lose a unit or two units in a battle. Happens, right? Then these guys are not worth necessarily using as a filler unit in that situation. Like, peasant bowmen might be worth it from that perspective. But we move on to proper Bretonnian cavalry, which are, of course, Knights of the Realm and Questing Knights. So, with Knights of the Realm, they're kind of B-tier unit. They're not horrible. There's better units. They're similar in the sense of Empire Knights. Like, this is the actual proper competition to Empire Knights. Or Reiksguard, though I would say Reiksguard are just flat out the better unit compared to Knights of the Realm, which is probably saying something about Bretonnian recruitment priorities as opposed to Empire recruitment priorities. Also may have to do with the fact that the Empire got a rework and Bretonia didn't. See, here's the thing about these guys. They're a shock cav. They don't have the durability of even Empire Knights, or roughly equivalent, right? They can get a good amount of mass. They can get a very good charge bonus. They have better melee stats all around than pretty much all other equivalent tier 3 cavalry units. Not tier 2. Tier 3 cavalry units. So from that perspective, they're okay, but that's the thing, they're just okay. They lack the longevity in a long campaign. They can be easy enough to get that first vow for them, so that's one of the benefits, but I wouldn't put them higher than B tier. Then we have Questing Knights. With Questing Knights, I would argue that they're an A tier unit. There's a couple of reasons behind this. But one of the problems Bretonia has inherently is that they don't have a melee line worth a damn. Or they have a couple of units, but they're annoying to recruit and not necessarily worth massing. Reasons on that in just a moment. So Bretonia desperately needs a durable enough unit, especially in siege battles, or to hold the line while the shock cavalry does its job. This is what questing knights provide. They're a two-handed swordsman on a horse. I guess that's the proper way of viewing it. Two-handed swordsman, Empire great swords on a horse. Kind of the way you want to view questing knights. They're not charge cavalry. They're not the best melee unit either, obviously, because they come with all the inherent downsides that cavalry do have in that particular role. But that is kind of the value proposition that you're going to get. Now, keep in mind, just because I'm putting this unit as an A-tier unit does not mean I consider it an A-tier unit overall. I consider it an A-tier unit in the context of Bretonia's unit roster, specifically, and whether or not it actually has value in their campaigns. It does. This is the one unit that actually does have genuine value throughout the campaign, because replacing these can be a bit trickier than you might think. Like, that's another thing, longevity. Like, Knights of the Realm you can replace reasonably quickly even, or rather once you get to tier 4. But questing knights, they're a bit more difficult to actually get a replacement for them during the course of a campaign. So that would be my perspective. Then we have Pegasus Knights. So Pegasus Knights is where Bretonia really starts to shine, or rather what they're doing starts to put a light on where Bretonia shines from a cavalry perspective, though not necessarily these guys, because they're a bit too squishy. So they're flying cav units, shock cav units. They're pretty decent at job. Just go in, get out. And because Bretonia may have good relations with the Order Tide factions, which have the majority of ranged units in the game, for the most part, exception of Skaven and Dark Elves, but a lot of the factions you will be fighting in any Bretonian campaign don't necessarily have a great deal of range capability. They may have flying capability, but Pegasus Knights will destroy any other flying unit in the game, or most of the other flying units in the game. Hell, I would take a couple of these guys and put them against the Thunder Barge, and maybe they win, maybe they don't. Depends on the numbers, all that kind of stuff. But they can hold their own. That's the important thing. They probably wouldn't win against, say, an Exalted Bloodthirster, but they probably would do decently well. So they're a good shock cav that's flying. And that flying capability is really important because it gives you that maneuverability on the battlefield in general, not just in field battles, but in sieges. Should I put them as an A tier? Well, not quite, I think. And it's not necessarily because of the downsides of the unit itself necessarily. Here, like, if it was just the unit itself, I would argue that it probably deserves an A tier, but because Bretonia also has two other options that fill the same role. So that's worth considering. Then we have Grail Knights. So Grail Knights are Bretonia's premier, or one of Bretonia's premier land cav units, with all of the issues that come from being a land cav unit. They're roughly equivalent as Demigryph Knights, though they would probably beat Demigryph Knights in a straight-up fight. But that's not how you compare units. You don't compare Unit A to Unit B. You compare Unit A within army, within the first army, compared to Unit B in the second army, and the various things you gotta deal with, magic, all that kind of stuff. Grail Knights are a great shock cav unit on the ground. They're pretty durable, though some other cav units, heavy cav units, may be more durable than they are, but still, a fairly durable, solid unit. But on the expensive side, can be annoying unlocking the Grail Vow, though to be honest, the questing vow is genuinely the most annoying thing. Like, if the questing vow would be far more easily unlocked, and questing knights were like a tier 2 unit as opposed to a tier 3 unit, well, yeah, I feel like Bretonia should have Knights Errant at tier 1, Knights of the Realm, and questing knights at tier 2. That is my point of view, because you look at the rest of the unit roster, I think their campaign situation would be a lot better. But then you would have the vow issue. But all the same, I think Grail Knights are a very solid cav unit. Not the best that Bretonia does have, however. Because the best land cav that Bretonia has are the Grail Guardians. So Grail Guardians, exceptional unit on land, good unit in a siege, throw them in the middle of an enemy settlement, they'll probably kill everything in sight. even though they're mounted with all the inherent issues that do come from them. So they do have a great deal of capability. They do come from a different building than the other cavalry units of Bretonia, but it is a building you're going to get anyway because it offers you a hero with replenishment and magic user. So that is an important thing to unlock in your Bretonnian campaign. These guys will do very, very well, especially when you consider like life magic combined with the Bretonnian army. Like, yeah, a decent number of these, or even an entire stack of these, would do pretty well in a battle. Then we have Royal Pegasus Knights. This is the unit that prevented the Pegasus Knights from being an S tier or an A tier unit. Because basically, take a Pegasus Knight, all that mobility, all that kind of capability in a battle, put it on an even stronger mount, better unit. Basically, you get a Royal Pegasus Knight. Very strong unit, very strong against air units, very difficult to take down. And insofar as it goes in terms of aerial duels, you might think that the Royal Hippogriff Knights might win out, but a couple of these, or maybe even a single unit of these, or two certainly, will take down a Thunder Barge for all the shit that people say about that. They're very, very good against large targets. They're good at a shock cavalry unit. They have that mobility on the battlefield. But then you also have Hippogriff Knights, Royal Hippogriff Knights. These are the ultimate expression of Bretonia's cavalry. So this is why Bretonia, by the way, does well with cavalry in the late game. They have a lot of issues in their campaigns, but it is units like these that elevate Bretonia. It's not that they have really good land cav unit, because there's factions that can compete. Like, you consider, Cast Knights with Lances of Sinnelleos, or Blood Crushers against Grail Knights. That's a different discussion. But in terms of flying cav, with all the mobility benefits that you get from flying units, with all the power that a Bretonnian Knight has, you get an extraordinarily powerful army. Can be a bit annoying to use, because then we get into the infantry roster. I don't really know what to say about the Bretonia's infantry roster except the following. Every single unit, with exception of a couple of units, but every single unit that Bretonia has in terms of their infantry roster, with exception of like the higher tier ones, is complete garbage. I'm not even going to discuss them. Like, you have peasants. They can be very cheap, but they're worse than Skaven slaves. Well, okay, they're roughly equivalent than Skaven slaves, but I would dare say Skaven slave slingers are probably a more useful unit to recruit in a campaign than these guys. So that's peasants. What about all the different versions, the 5 different freaking versions of men-at-arms? Men-at-arms with just swords, men-at-arms with spears and shields, men-at-arms with swords and shields, men-at-arms with spears, men-at-arms with polearms. They're all awful garbage. Low leadership, low morale, so low leadership, low HP, low durability, anything. Like armored, melee stats, melee survivability, melee damage, they're not good in anything. Seriously, they will break from some of the easiest units to defeat on the battlefield because they're that bad in a battle. So yeah, men-at-arms are never worth recruiting in a Bretonnian army. If you're looking for a filler unit that's not a cav unit to recruit in an army, there are other options. Then we have battle pilgrims. So with respect to battle pilgrims, I'm just gonna zoom out a bit. With respect to battle pilgrims, I wish I could say it's a B tier unit, but it's kind of really a C tier unit. Not a horrible unit. If you're looking to get to recruit any kind of Bretonnian infantry, okay, I would actually say like they're a B tier unit. Because they're reasonably available from a structure you'll want to construct anyway because hero capacity and all that. And they're actually the best of Bretonia's units, infantry units in combat, with exception like one regiment right now. They can do a decent amount of damage. They can hold the line decently well. And when I emphasize decent, when I say decent, don't think even great, like think of just lower than great swords to some extent. I mean, Jade Warriors can do better than these guys in some situations, but they're capable of holding their own in a battle. they're not a complete waste of gold like the men-at-arms. Like, this is the thing. Like, why recruit men-at-arms when you can recruit battle pilgrims, which are flat out the better unit in every singular way possible? Well, with the exception of anti-large, but hello, this is why you have cav to deal with. Like, if you want to deal with large entities as Bretonia, you have plenty of damn options for that. Then we have foot squires. Yeah, I'm going to say foot squires are a C-tier unit. So they're trying to be great swords of the Empire. They're worse than great swords in almost every single conceivable way, and they're harder to recruit because they require tier 4. That's, like, this unit, like, if you made this unit a tier 2 unit, that's probably where they deserve. Think of an armor Kossar, which is a tier 2 unit being only available at tier 4. That is Bretonia's infantry roster situation. And that's kind of the problem. It's like, it's not that Bretonia has the worst infantry in the game. No, it's also the fact, though they do have some of the worst infantry in the game, but it's also the fact that the one decent option outside of battle pilgrims that they have to recruit is something that they'll struggle to recruit because they require a higher tier. Now, you might think, oh, Bretonia has a lot of growth. Yeah, they also have bad provinces, which limit that growth, hinder that growth. Like, let me put it like this. In 30 turns, I can get to, like, tier 4, tier 5, reasonably in many campaigns I play. I can do it as Bretonia, but not in Bretonia, which should tell you something about Bretonia as a location in the game. Then we have Grail Reliquary. It can be a decent enough support unit, though it's kind of a joke. Like, it's not completely useless, though it is something of a joke of a unit, really. Not necessarily worth bothering with. Can provide some useful support to the army, but that's roughly about it. Then we have Peasant Bowmen. So we have 3 versions: fire arrows, poison arrows, and regular version. They're all C-tier units. They're not the worst archers in the game. They're also peasants. So peasants, with all the inherent economic situations you have early on, like once you start playing a Bretonnian campaign, sure, eventually you'll get to a ridiculous number of peasants, but early on, when it matters, you will have a limit on that. So you might think, oh, just recruit a bunch of peasant archers, right? There was that strategy of using stacks of peasant archers, especially in Warhammer 2. I don't think it's quite as viable in Warhammer 3. A number of reasons, AI, economy, all that kind of stuff. But as far as range units go, yeah, they're not really great. They're essentially a filler unit. That's it. Like, I wouldn't necessarily view foot squires as a filler unit, but I certainly do view peasant archers as a filler unit. So archers for Bretonia on land, the problem is, it's not even their combat capability, because they'll do some decent level of damage. It's the fact that their leadership is pretty bad, and they don't really have any kind of good flank protection, right? They don't have any unit to protect them. You might think, well, Bretonia can get Cav to protect them. And then Cav blocks their line of sight. Like, that's kind of thing with range units. Even when range combat is working perfectly fine, you still don't want something to block the sight. You know, a horse will, a guy mounted on a horse will do that. And that's kind of the one problem. Their combat effectiveness is kind of limited. Yes, you can use heroes. Yes, you can use battle pilgrims. Though, to be honest, if you get battle pilgrims, they're kind of not flat out not worth recruiting. Like, you're better off getting a line of battle pilgrims to hold a line in a certain sector of the battlefield, backed up by trebuchets for range damage, and while your cavalry does the work. Because that's the other thing to mention about Bretonia. We start talking about trebuchets. Regular trebuchets for Bretonia are an A-tier unit. I know, this is going to sound freaking ridiculous. Wait, the Cav faction has a good artillery option? Yes, it's actually one of the better artillery options in the game. To explain on this subject, trebuchets may have some accuracy issues, and you obviously have to concern yourself with friendly fire. But when these things hit, they hit like a truck. Importantly, they really complement the Bretonian playstyle, because Bretonia has a lot of sieges in the area of the campaign map. And even if you're playing Rapunzel or Alberg, you do still have a good amount of sieges to deal with. Trebuchets are a tier 2 unit in a faction that lacks range, that has really bad range units overall, in a faction that has mediocre infantry units and is reliant on cav. Well, you can't rely on cav if you're not creating openings. This is why it's an A tier unit. You're creating now openings, you're creating mobility for your cavalry on a battle. You can even use them to position in such a way that you're harassing the enemy army. Their enemy army is going to start marching towards them, and then you can retreat them off the battlefield if you want to. You corner camp with them or something like that. Or you can have a line of battle pilgrims or maybe questing knights. Because that's the thing about trebuchets. They don't get affected by having cav in front of them soaking the damage in the same freaking way archers are. I mean, unless the enemy really closes the gap, but that's the thing about trebuchets. They will do a lot of damage from very, very far away. And here's the thing about Bretonia. Bretonia may not have the best hero selection or lord selection, but their regular lords, their legendary lords, and heroes can soak up a decent amount of damage. So one of my strategies I use is, I send Lewin, or I send a Paladin, or I send Rapunz, or even Albric, as much of a joke as he is. I send them in the middle of an enemy army. I let them get surrounded. I mean, Lewin could probably kill half of them anyway. And then I unleash trebuchets on that enemy army while they're all blobbed up. It is a strategy that works, and that's the reason trebuchets are an A-tier unit. Not an S-tier, because then you have the upgraded, blessed field trebuchets. So they don't do friendly fire from the splash damage. Okay, the rock itself still does damage if it hits, one of your friendly units, but the splash damage of these things. So it's even better than the field trebuchets in that role. It's great to support a bunch of Grail Guardians. It's great to support, say, Pegasus Knights or Royal Pegasus Knights or Hippogriff Knights that might, you might throw them in the middle of an enemy army and you want something to support them with a lot of freaking damage. That's what Blessed Field Trebuchets do during the course of a Bretonnian campaign. Now, they are annoying to recruit, to be sure. I know they can be annoying to recruit because of the tier requirement. And that's where, the issues of Bretonia's situation do come in. It is kind of an exception over here with Bretonia that I'm saying, all these high tier units are really worth recruiting when I've talked down so many other factions with their high tier units. But here's the thing to be said about Bretonia compared to other factions. Inherently, when you're playing a Bretonian campaign, you're not going to have the highest number of armies in a campaign. You might get a bunch of peasants, but they're really garbage armies. You might as well have a bunch of clan rats and Skaven slaves in those armies, really. So you're put in a situation where you have cav. And the thing about it, it's very clear that some cav options are just flat out better than others. A cav army with trebuchets and maybe battle pilgrims, if you need a couple of units to protect those trebuchets in melee, is a pretty good Bretonnian army. It will get shit done. And that's the thing, like, you look at something like a Grail Knight. Of course, a Grail Knight is worth recruiting far more than a Knight of the Realm. You would recruit the Knight of the Realm until you can recruit the Grail Knight, and then you're only recruiting Grail Knights. That's the difference between, say, Dwarves and Bretonia. Because you look at Thunder Barges for the Dwarves. Are they worth recruiting in a campaign? Maybe. Sure, there's an argument in there, but you have plenty of other options that are just as viable to spend your money on. Whereas in a Bretonnian campaign, you do want to go for those higher upgrades. You want to make your armies as strong as possible. The vows limit how many effective armies you actually have until much, much, much later than tier 5 in a Bretonnian campaign. So that is why I'm ranking these units higher, because they're obviously clear upgrades than the units before, and you want to get them. That's it. That's the situation. It's kind of unique from that perspective, I guess. Compared to other factions, because in a lot of factions I rank the lower tier units much higher and the higher tier units much lower, right? Because of availability. But Bretonia's lower tier units are so bad. And also, it's worth saying this, Bretonia has an insane amount of money. Like, once you start rolling the cash in a Bretonian campaign, and you'll be able to do so quickly, the issue you're going to have is not about, like, can I afford recruiting these units? It's going to be unlocking vows to be able to maintain those units. Like, if you have a lord leading an army of vows, you can afford an entire freaking stack of Hippogriff Knights, or stack upon stack upon stack across your entire campaign. because Bretonia has that much freaking cash. I mean, I think Dark Elves get more cash, but yeah, Bretonia has a lot going for it. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.